Let me now introduce Tony Pace. Tony is the founder of Cerebral Graffiti. He was the former global CMO for Subway. Tony currently serves as the chairman of the Association of National Advertisers and has founded his own marketing consultancy, Cerebral Graffiti. A transformative marketer who has built businesses across the marketing spectrum, he previously served as a CMO for Subway for 9 years, first joining the franchise in 2006 as the CMO of its advertising fund before becoming the global CMO in 2012. While being the CMO at Subway, Pace's contribution to the fast food restaurant franchise included improving its brand standing to number 5 in the QSR segment, to number 2 in terms of market share, and number 1 in terms of the number of locations with more than 44,000 worldwide. Subway also rose to become the 41st most valuable global brand, according to Millward Brown's Brand Z study. He also introduced a new value brand into the consumer lexicon, the $5 footlong. Prior to Subway, Pace managed and developed businesses and clients for Young & Rubicam and McCann Erickson. Clients included such as Coca-Cola, Capital One, KFC, General Motors, and Exxon. He co-founded Momentum, the now global experiential marketing company. He also ran McCann's Southwest unit, which included offices in Houston, Dallas, and Austin. Pace is a 1979 graduate of the University of Notre Dame with a double major in economics and the general program of liberal studies. He earned his MBA from the Wharton School of Business at the University of Pennsylvania. Without further ado, let's have Pace talk about.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Great to be back in South Bend. Brings back an awful lot of memories. I think the first thing I want to say is I was in what was then called the General Program of Liberal Studies. I now understand it's the Program of Liberal Studies. I don't think either name is adequate, so as a marketer, my free advice of the day is that they should change the name to the Great Books Program with an extra M and an extra E on the end. I know a little bit about branding, and I think that would simplify things because all the years since my graduation, I've always had to explain what the General Program of Liberal Studies is, and it's a lot easier and a lot simpler if you say a Great Books Program. So I'm going to tell you a lot of stories today because I've done a lot of pretty interesting things. I hope you find them interesting as well. I have, pretty firm philosophical points of view about what marketing is and kind of where it's going. And I would actually appreciate it if you have questions or you think that there's something that you agree or disagree with right away, go ahead and put your hand up and we'll talk about it. I actually come from the school that intelligent people can disagree. So always happy to have that discussion. One of the things that I decided to do, seeing all the presentations this morning, I wanted to give some examples of kind of real-time marketing these days because Rick's very good presentation talked about the difference being in execution. And behind the phrase cerebral graffiti, the word cerebral, of course, is exposed to conjure up the notion of being strategic and thoughtful about what you do. But graffiti is certainly art, but it's also art that some people might not necessarily want to be there, right? So if you think about the reference point of the $5 footlong, when we came up with the whole campaign for that, it started with this simple hand gesture, right? And yes, that was actually mine. I guess that's the benefit of being in general program. I can put things quite simply. And the creative team came up with a great piece of music. Now, if you've been in or around the advertising business for any point in time, probably for the last 20 years, really great creative people that I had a chance to work with, hated the notion of doing original music. They would derisively refer to it as a jingle, right? So to this day, the music that you might be able to hum for $5 foot long, a lot of people will call a jingle. I kind of chafe at that because it's not really a jingle in the old-fashioned sense of the word. You know, the reference was made this morning to Like to Teach the World to Sing. Well, that was a great song. I guess you can call it a jingle, but it was actually written by Bill Backer back in the day, who worked at one of the places I did, McCann Erickson. What we were really trying to do with $5 foot long is we wanted to have a simple, almost musical sting, if you will, that would get in people's minds, right? And, you know, all marketing after the fact appears obvious and simple, but you wouldn't have believed the debate that we had early on about what were we going to call this thing, right? So a real good friend of mine, a franchisee in South Florida by the name of Stu Frankel, had a location that was in a hospital, and he called up and said, I'm going to put up this thing and I'm going to sell footlongs for $5. So literally it said footlongs $5. And he started to get pretty good business. And then some of the other guys around him said, yeah, we should put up those signs that says footlongs for $5. So this thing kept growing and growing and growing. And we did a very, very simple thing, because all marketing is about branding and differentiation in my mind. We just kind of flipped that. We said, you know what? We don't want this to be a product for a price. We want this thing to be a brand. And it's got alliteration going for it, which is always a good thing. So we said, we're going to call this the $5 footlong. Now, I could probably do an entire presentation on that and all the nuances of that. But $5 footlongs essentially meant that the Great Recession never happened at Subway. The very first week we put that advertising on the air, and I kind of chuckle about it now, you know, talk about having to have a pretty good stomach. There's a pretty boisterous lot of franchisees and development agents at Subway, and we did a broadcast of the creative work before it went on air. And a lot of people didn't like the music, and they didn't like the hand gesture, and they didn't think it was going to work. Well, when you're in a retail business, you get pretty quick reaction to what's happening. And I'll never forget that we put it on, I think it was March 22nd of 2008. And we get our sales results. You know, you get daily sales results, but you get your weekly sales results on Thursday. And I was actually in Nice, France for our European team meeting. And I was there with our sadly now deceased co-founder, Fred DeLuca. And the numbers came out, and you know, the time difference and everything, we're looking at them, it's like sales were up 26.8%. Okay? And you're like, what? So at that point in time, believe it or not, it's kind of hard to think back about it this way, but at that point in time, it was supposed to be a 4-week promotion. So literally I said, and you have to understand that in a franchise organization, everybody thinks, oh my God, you're going to discount my price. There are a couple of my really kind of dear friends who were on the franchise board that we were accountable to. They had actually had very strenuous arguments against me. And these are guys that I've been friends with for a long time and still friendly with today. They were like, there's no way we're doing footlongs for $5. It's going to kill the business, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, so we had to basically change that attitude pretty quickly. And you know, after about a year, what I was able to say was, if you looked at the $5 footlong, just based on sales of $5 footlong, by itself, it would have been the 9th largest brand in the quick service restaurant category. We kept that for an awful long time. We initially offered it across the menu, and then we narrowed it down over time. We had to be sensitive to price and profits, of course. I think if I were to do anything differently, we had a plan to kind of phase away from it after a number of years, because you had issues with cost pressure. But I frankly wish that I had fought harder to keep that over an extended period of time. But you know, frankly, when you have different interests in an organization, it becomes a little bit tough to do that. So I tell you that story as kind of a historical footnote, but it's also kind of leads into the thought about, you know, how you need to get to people today, right? So if you go back to the hand gesture, right? So that's really good advertising, but you can also use it lots of different places, right? And if you have a lot of different people that represent you, perhaps they can do that in social media, perhaps they can do that in public appearances, and that really worked quite well for us. Now, I'm still a big believer in television advertising. It's harder and harder than ever to get to big audiences. But one of the things that you have available to you today is that you can collaborate with different folks on content. So those three pictures that you see up here, they're a little bit small. You've got the TV show Chuck. Anybody remember the show Chuck on NBC? My good friend Zachary Levi in the middle. You got the show Community, which is another show on NBC. And then you got The Biggest Loser. Now, the interesting thing about all those pieces are we did those things with kind of a strategic intent to make sure that we were visible. But what we really worked very hard on was doing authentic messaging. So let me start by talking about Chuck for a second. So we did a couple episodes of Chuck, and I'm probably, when it comes to creative freedom for people you're collaborating with, I'm probably pretty liberal, right? So when you're doing collaboration with content creators, it's not like you're making an ad and you're going to tell them this is exactly the language it's going to be. That just doesn't work. So I gave them a fair amount of flexibility. Well, frankly, in one of the early episodes we were in with Chuck, I think they went a little too far, right? So they had a bachelor party, and a 6-foot Subway sandwich was part of the bachelor party. And as happens at bachelor parties, a couple of the guys got sick. So I had all sorts of people yelling and screaming at me to never be in Chuck again. Well, then an interesting thing happened because we actually had point of purchase materials up in the restaurants in addition to the integrations in the show. There is and was a pharmaceutical sales rep in Western New Jersey by the name of Wendy Farrington. And Wendy Farrington was a big fan of Subway, and Wendy Farrington was also a big fan of Chuck. And NBC was debating what to do about whether or not they should keep the show. So Wendy contacted me. So what's different about being a marketer now? You got to basically make sure you talk to anybody who's going to come in, because otherwise you might miss something. Wendy contacted me, couldn't believe that she got me. Fortunately, I had a great assistant at Subway. And she said, I want to do something around the finale of this year's Chuck with Subway so we can show how many fans there are, so maybe they'll continue the show. And I said, okay, that's a good idea. I said, so I actually know the people in NBC pretty well. Let me call them and see if they're amenable to that. So at that point in time, it was Ben Silverman. Ben and I were, brothers from another mother, I think, in terms of how we kind of looked at the world. And he said, this is a great idea. He said, and if you commit to this, we'll also make an announcement that we're keeping the show, because it was on the bubble at that point in time. And I'm going to give you credit for that because you brought this to us. So they put together, meaning Wendy and her fans, they actually did a foot-long end finales evening for the last show in May, and we track our sales pretty closely. There was about a 1.6% increase, as I recall. The number might be off slightly, but we were able to show that there was a demonstrable increase that night because of this social event. That kind of stuff doesn't happen all that often, right? And if we had tried to do that ourselves without a consumer reaching out to us and saying, hey, I'd like you guys to do it, it wouldn't have worked in any way, shape, or form. We created a kind of crazy character who was assuming Subway on the show Community. That got a lot of attention, and it also, created really a positive halo for us within the creative community. And then my friend Apollo Ono there, we were able to have some of the high-profile people we work with be part of Biggest Loser and be part of the events. That kind of stuff became part of the fabric of the show, so that if you talk to consumers about it, they thought Subway was actually, a quasi-producer of the show, if you will. So one other story I want to tell in regard to brands being makers of memories and makers of content. Years ago, when I was working for McCann Erickson and I helped start this company called Momentum, we were responsible for all of the local activation for the Olympic torch relay in 1996. And we had about 72, 73 people on the road every day activating before and after the torch was going around. It started out in California. I think it was LA. I went out and visited the guys when they were up in San Francisco and various points across the route. And as they were winding towards the East Coast, the team was really kind of tired because they were essentially every day they were up at 6 in the morning and they were going till about 11 at night. And it was really a grind. So when they came to New York, we were going to do a big event for them at Rockefeller Center that night. And it was a Monday, and I said, you know, I should probably go up, as soon as they crossed the George Washington Bridge, I should probably go up to Washington Heights and see the guys there and just kind of let them know that I'm here and all that kind of stuff. You know, the boss is paying attention, if you will. So back in those days, Washington Heights was not a very nice neighborhood, let's just put it that way. So I had on blue jeans and I had on a polo shirt that had the Olympic Torch Relay logo. And I got there a little bit early because I'm sure traffic on the GW Bridge was bad as it always is. So I was walking around the neighborhood for about a half an hour. And I had that paraphernalia on, and I had about 3 different kids, all between the ages of, I would say, 8 and maybe 13, come up to me and make a variation of this comment. They said, "Mister, thank you so much for bringing this to our neighborhood, because nothing good ever happens here." So at that same point in time, I was also responsible for Coca-Cola Advertising. So the next day I went back to my great media friends at McCann Erickson. I said, "Tell me, how many impressions do we have to have in traditional media for me to have the same brand memory created as what was created by those kids seeing that yesterday?" Now, as a marketer, you're always thinking about depth of impressions, versus reaching a large-scale audience, and there's always those kind of trade-offs. And I couldn't necessarily replicate that experience for 3 million people, but I guarantee you those kids still think positively about Coca-Cola because of that experience. So let me take a little bit of a step back. I know Bob and I were having a little conversation about this earlier. You hear all the big technology guys talk about all the things that we're going to be able to do without people, right? Artificial intelligence, here it comes, right? Watson can do well on Jeopardy, and they have all these platforms about data and analytics so you're going to be able to have artificial intelligence do marketing. Well, I say that's poppycock, to be honest with you. Rick was saying this earlier, and I'd actually like to build on it. One of my favorite phrases in business, and it has been for a long time, even before we have the quantity of data we have now, is we have all these organizations, and even with great consumer insight people, organizations are fundamentally data-rich and insight-poor, right? And I'm not a technologist, so maybe I'm a little bit off with this, but that's a picture of the black hole, obviously. And the fact of the matter is, if you have all this data, but you're not grinding it in all sorts of ways, I'm not sure you're going to get to the next great insight, right? And to me, Starry Night, creation of stars, that kind of moment, you have to have some form of energy that is going to create those hypotheses, right? So I may come to your event in Boston to have the debate, because at the end of the day, I don't know, this wasn't genius or anything like that, but there's no amount of synthesis of previous actions that have happened in marketing that would have led artificial intelligence to create that, right? And the human element to me in marketing is still very important. Don't misunderstand. I looked at data all the time at Subway, okay? The question is, it's like taking the old GMAT test. What's a major factor? What's a minor factor, right? I mean, you have to be able to sort through those things. And it's ironic that people want to hand off the decision for big marketing decisions to a machine or something else, because it doesn't work that way. At the end of the day, it's your call, and you have to be accountable for it. So again, grind through the data all you want, but the human element is really important. Now, as a sidebar, it's kind of very interesting to me, coming from the food business, and I worked at the food businesses prior to Subway, that the word artificial is looked at in a good light here, right? So nobody wants GMOs, nobody wants artificial anything, and now artificial intelligence is a good thing. I would rather have the creativity of human beings, right? So yeah, those are my two great kids. But I want to talk about some of the foundational things in marketing, which I don't think get enough conversation, because I do, in fact, believe that marketing is art greatly informed by science. So that's actually the old, now new cornerstone of the Wharton School of Business. Sorry for showing my other graduate association, but I had a couple great years there. And a lot of the foundation blocks in marketing, even though there's been wonderful technological advances, haven't changed, right? So here's a question for you all. How many people here spend a lot of time thinking about one of those most fundamental of the 4 Ps, which is a positioning statement? That's pretty good. That's great. I'm actually happy to hear that. So the one that I always used is to the consumer audience. Brand X is the brand of whatever the category is, and category definition can be very creative. That, point or points of difference, so that, and then benefits. So I don't know if this is public information, but I'll use it anyway because I probably memorized it 100 times. So the one for Subway that we created, that we kept for a very long time, is to consumers seeking choices in fast food. Subway is the fast food restaurant that offers fresh, healthful, and flavorful options at a good value so that you can look good, feel good, and perform at your best. Now, you know, again, being an old general program guy, people say, wow, you know, that's just words, and those are broad words, and what do those words really mean? Those words are incredibly important, and I'd like to think we were pretty choiceful of that, because every marketing action you take, if you're being strategic, has to go back to why in the positioning statement does this thing make sense? I also personally believe in the whole notion of brand personality. I guess if you go way back when I worked on businesses like Tang Instant Breakfast Drink and Thomas's English Muffins, we would use a longer statement about the personality, and we may even talk to a specific person that people would know that were kind of representative of that brand. We did it a little bit different for Subway. We just had 4 words: young, fun, active, and current. Let me talk about the last couple words, active and current. Everybody wants to be young and fun, even us ancient graduates of Notre Dame, right? The active piece was incredibly important. It was important because Subway was primarily known for weight loss, and that is a very small segment of how people think about eating and what they want to be. Active is a really, really big piece. And then there's this word current. I've seen more people use it over time. I think some of my old team have gone to other places and have started using it, actually. Across the course of my career, I've sat in many presentations where I was presenting creative work to somebody, and inevitably the CFO or the CEO, assuming the CEO didn't come from marketing, would say what I would say is the dumbest thing in the world, which is, we want our brand to be cool. And I would always cringe. So my kind of standard statement, which I applied at Subway, to the point that people could repeat it to me, so I guess that's pretty good, is that, remember what it was like being a sophomore in high school? If you stood up and said, hey, look at me, I'm cool, at least back in my day, you would have had spitballs thrown at you, right? So what you need to do is you need to do things that are very much synced up with what's going on now, because cool is an outcome. Cool is a conclusion that you want other people to draw. You don't, if you say that you're cool, people are going to push back on you real hard. But if you're associated with a lot of things that are part of the culture at a particular point in time, let other consumers make that conclusion that you are in fact cool. So again, to me, those are simple words. That's from one brand's perspective. But if you really imbue your team as a CMO or as a marketer with an understanding of what you're trying to do, they start playing that stuff back to you. Now, people can get bored because everybody says, oh, that's the same positioning statement we've had for 6 years. Well, when you're growing 10% a year or more, you probably shouldn't change it. So part of that whole active thing was, what better way to show that a brand's active than to get involved with athletes, right? Because if you're gonna look good, feel good, and perform at your best, athletes always wanna perform at their best. If they win, they feel good. And frankly, when you're in the kind of shape you need to be as an elite athlete, you're certainly gonna look good. So, understanding that this may get some derision, who was the very, very first athlete we used at Subway when we started getting involved with folks? Anybody got any idea here? I'll give you a hint. It was April of 2006. Nice guess, but no. It was actually Reggie Bush. So yes, as a Notre Dame alum, I used somebody from USC. But if you think back about it, at that point in time, although he ended up going second in the NFL draft, he was the most exciting player. I mean, at that stadium over there, he did the Bush push and illegally got Matt Leinart into the end zone, right? Which Reggie would always, he's like, hey, they didn't call it. So, but he was, when you think back to current, right? When you think back to current, at that point in time, he was the noteworthy player. I mean, his highlight reel from SC was unbelievable, right? He had skill sets that were crazy, right? But again, as somebody who chafes when people talk about marketing and they'll use words like scheme or ploy or stunt, when we were starting to get involved in athletes, it wasn't just to use Reggie Bush for the 2 weeks around the NFL draft. It was to say, how can we continually use athletes in a way that makes sense? So I was going to ask the question, who is this guy? But I think you probably know since you said Michael Phelps. That's Michael Phelps as a lacrosse player before he actually became a swimmer. And I'll fully admit that having worked with him over an extended period of time, that I'm extremely fond of Michael. Been through a couple of tough periods with him, but think we've gotten through those, and the people around him, including his mom, were very complimentary to me about kind of helping him through those circumstances, because there were some pretty tough nights. But I'm very, very pleased that we worked with him, because even today he's incredibly talked about on a whole lot of levels. So let me tell you a couple stories that you may find interesting, and again, shoot questions at me as you want. So I was down in Tampa for the Super Bowl in 2009. I was playing a really bad round of golf with Scott Van Pelt from ESPN, and I got off the golf course on Saturday afternoon or a little before noontime, and my phone was ringing. And it was a fellow by the name of Peter Carlisle, who's Michael's agent. Peter and I were pretty good friends. At that point in time, we had worked through a lot of stuff to get him lined up to work with Subway. And Peter said to me, Tony, we got a big problem. And I'm like, what's that? He's like, there's a photo that's coming out. It's coming out at 6 p.m. Eastern time. It'll be in a London paper. And it shows Michael with drug paraphernalia from a party that he was at the University of South Carolina. I'm like, great. What do you want me to do with this? He said, I want you to know, you're probably going to get peppered with questions. At that Super Bowl, I don't know if you folks are familiar with Mike Lynch. Mike Lynch is also Notre Dame. Mike was Visa. Mike and I were actually going to see each other at the game on Sunday, and Visa at that point also worked with Michael. So I had to drive back to where I was staying. I was actually staying with the NBC folks. And I was kind of in a funky mood about what the heck to do about this, because at that point in time, we hadn't really done much with Michael yet, but people were going to obviously say, what are you going to do? You're going to dump him, all that kind of stuff. And I walk into see the folks at NBC, and Jeff Zucker was the president of NBC at the time. And a couple of his folks were around him. They're like, Tony, you look like something's bothering him. I'm like, yeah. So I said it was something about Phelps, but I didn't want to say anything because the news was kind of embargoed. So Jeff Zucker was a great guy, but is also extremely high-strung. I thought the blood vessels were going to pop in his neck. He's like, you got to tell me. I'm like, all right, here it is. Well, if you think about my brand's investment in him, my brand's investment in him was about this big. NBC, he was the face of the Olympics for them, right? So the next couple days were crazy, but I think the story is illustrative of kind of real-time marketing in a sense. So one brand that was working with him, unfortunately, came out on the Monday and said that they were dumping him. The sad thing about that, from my perspective, is that was actually not accurate. Their contract with him was actually up. So they were trying to take a victory lap saying, well, they were good, they were doing the right thing. So we were getting pounded all week. Everybody wanted us to make a comment. I did a little time in PR firms as part of the rotation when I was young in Rubicam, and back in those days, you used to call PR people flacks, right? So our PR firm was getting tired of getting pounded by the press, and I said, you're being hired to be flacks here. I don't want to put a statement out, right? So all week long, I actually talked to Michael multiple times. He was, kind of beside himself because the press was hounding him at home in Baltimore. And I said, listen, we're not going to say anything unless something happens, and don't worry, we're not making a decision just yet. And we were actually tracking every night. We were looking at, how people were reacting to Michael. So before we signed him, he was on a pedestal as high as any athlete we'd ever seen in terms of all the numbers. He certainly got knocked down a little bit that week, but as the week went on, it kind of came back a little bit. So the PR people finally got me agreed to do a statement, and since I was editor of the Observer when I was here, I tend to write my own stuff. So I threw all their stuff out, and the statement that I came up with, and everybody said that's pretty good, was, like most Americans, we're disappointed in Michael Phelps' behavior. Also, like most Americans, we've chosen to forgive him. We look forward to working with him in the future. And we had gotten that information because we're doing the polling kind of every day. But I said to the team, I don't want you to send this statement out. Just, we have it. If we need it, we're fine, right? So after a week of board meetings down in South Florida, I get on a plane and fly home, and I land at LaGuardia. And I turn on my BlackBerry, yes, used BlackBerries back then, and I had 681 messages. And the reason was, while I was on that plane, ESPN, with whom we had a real good, at least I thought, relationship, had run in their bottom line scroll that Subway was dumping Michael Phelps. So one of my faults is that I can use profanity occasionally when I'm not happy. So I called the folks at ESPN and I blistered them pretty good. And I said, you are running that statement word for word in your scroll the rest of tonight and tomorrow morning on an appropriate rotation. And I said, and if you don't, I said, we're going to not be doing much business going forward. That statement got out there. Jenny knows Associated Press is still a great thing. AP picked it up and it went out there. And all of, Peter Carlisle said to me, all Michael's people said to me, that's basically ended the conversation. So we were through that with him once. And I went through it kind of again with him when he had the DWI incident about a year ago, a year and a half ago. And even in that circumstance, that was probably pretty close to my heart because I spent about 6 years on the board of directors of Mothers Against Drunk Driving. And, when you deal with high-profile people, everybody kind of coddles them. I kind of let them have it. And the nice thing, to paint the long story on that, is that, he obviously had a great Olympics in Rio, and a lot of his team said, you talking tough to him actually helped an awful lot because he went into rehab, and that really worked out pretty well. So those are kind of the tough pieces on Michael. The great piece is, he's the world's most decorated Olympic athlete at this point. And he's actually in a great place. And we used him in many, many, many different ways for Subway, right? So you might have seen that he was up playing golf in the kind of, warm-up rounds for the Ryder Cup the other day. He actually did that for us back in 2012 when they played at Medina. Even though they didn't win, Michael got an awful lot of airtime, and we actually had him on the set with the announcers during the course of the weekend, especially on Saturday. And in this day and age, I would say to you that when we formulated the idea of working with high-profile people when I first got there, we thought that was going to be beneficial because it could put forth that healthy and active part of the brand. But what's happened over time because of social media and everything else, these folks are even more important because they have huge followings. So somebody may already know this, but how many people do you think are following his son Boomer on Twitter now? 800 and something thousand, right? So I'm actually right now, a little bit of a digression, but I'm actually working with a couple folks who want to work with Michael and his family going forward because they kind of see that as very valuable. And as much as the high-profile nature of who he is, it's not just him, it's his soon-to-be wife, Nicole, and also his son, Boomer, that are part of that equation. So, again, nice things, obviously, if you can see that photo carefully, you can see the tear from his eye. If you're around somebody that much, and if you have appreciation of athletes, one thing that I certainly love watching is people who have a great will to win. There's no way that you can bottle that kind of stuff, but he's got it, all the way through his being. And it was just, as a fan and somebody who knows him, it was obviously great to watch what he did in Rio and knowing what a good place he is in now. So Michael's obviously pretty well known. Does anybody know who that is? That's Nastia Liukin. Nastia Liukin won the overall gold in gymnastics in Beijing in 2008. We also worked with Nastia at Subway. And, again, I'm going to sound like proud friend on this stuff, but not too many people were interested in Nastia, even though she won the overall gold. So we got her involved with Subway. We put her in advertising. We did plenty of social media work with her. But one of the things that she said to me, and this is, again, how brands can be different now. You're a big brand, you got a big advertising budget. I said, Nastia, what do you want to do? She goes, well, I want to teach, but I also want to do some broadcasting. And I said, okay. So I said, we spend a lot of money with NBC, specifically on Olympic stuff. I said, I'll see if we can find a way to get you involved. So what she did, we had some features across various Olympic games called Subway Fresh Takes. Nastia was the person who brought the Subway Fresh Takes to NBC. That's kind of, in the print world, you might call it an advertorial, but it's kind of shared content. The people at NBC had to feel that she was bringing good content, and we didn't control that. We would suggest, they would talk to us, but ultimately it was their decision. But Nastia was always the one bringing the fresh take. Well, I don't know if you watched the Rio Games closely, but Nastia was a lead announcer on gymnastics. That happened in part because we had worked with her over the years. She did that stuff in Sochi. She was on the set of Today Show doing features in Sochi, and that worked very well. The same thing, frankly, with Apollo Ono. Apollo did a lot of stuff for us along the way. And again, he was like, Tony, anything you do to help me become more developed in this area, he goes, I want to do that. So Apollo is, if you watch the Winter Games, Apollo's doing a lot of stuff. They're both great on camera, and it's an example, I was going to tease Denise, but she's not here. It's a great example of how you can do long-term relationships with people that are really meaningful and beneficial, and it's not just about how big the check is that you write, okay? Okay, we paid people, but frankly, we didn't pay people all that much, but we were very mindful of how we could help them with their objectives, and we tried to do things for the long term. Anybody know who that guy at the center is? Justin Tuck. Yeah, as a matter of fact, I'm sending him a picture from last night. I didn't realize his jersey is on the wall at the linebacker. So he's doing a Giants viewing party on Monday night. So I'm gonna have to say he's a lot better dressed there than that ratty red Giants jersey that's on the thing at the linebacker. We work with Justin extensively too, right? And we obviously have Notre Dame in common, and actually now we actually have Wharton in common because he's at Wharton. I'm not sure what classes he's cutting to come to New York for the viewing party on Monday night. But he's another guy who, I was like, Justin, what do you want to do? Well, he and his wife Lauren, and Lauren's also a Notre Dame grad, they have the Tuck Rush for Literacy. Okay, how can I help you support that? At the end of the day, all of, Nastia, Apollo, Justin would all say, hey, Tony, it's not about the check that you're writing me. It's about the exposure you're giving me because you're helping me build my brand. And I'm not just doing that, magnanimously. I'm also doing it because that helps the Subway brand when we did that. So one of the other guys we work with, and this is a photo from a food truck out at a baseball field in Long Island where my son was playing travel baseball last year. The question is, well, do athletes actually work? Well, at least the guy running this food truck wanted to have a Mike Trout sandwich, which is a pretty good thing, even though the Angels have not done all that well. Mike is still probably a premium player in the space, and those kind of things stand out in the consumer lexicon today. So one other thing that I wanted to show you that's a little bit topical. So again, in that world of being current, we did lots of collaborations with Disney on their various films, right? We always tried to make sure that there was a good strategic intersection on that. And you got to get a lot of attention with it, right? Well, sadly, Brangelina kind of broke up, right? But what's the photo that's running on Extra? Look at the wallpaper in the background. It's got the Subway logo on it from like 5 years ago, right? So you sit there in these valuation sessions and say, how many impressions did we get during this 2 or 3 weeks? This is a latent valuation, right? And that show, The Biggest Loser show, the one with Apollo, is now running in syndication in places like Australia. So I still get messages from franchisees in Australia saying, hey, I saw the Apollo integration in Biggest Loser last night. That, given that more and more content is used again and again over longer periods of time, that kind of stuff has a longer tail, which is beneficial and not always recognized in the evaluation models. So yeah, I want to make sure, since I said USC and Wharton, that you saw a Notre Dame logo on me. So who knows who these folks are? Blackish, Anthony Anderson, Trace Ellis Ross, right? So what was I doing with them? Well, this actually didn't come to fruition, but it's the same kind of conversation. It's, Anthony, what do you want to work on? What are you doing that's interesting that I can help fund? And Tracy's like, well, here's what I'd like to do, because these guys know, perhaps better than some marketers do, frankly, they know that the advertiser dollars are incredibly important to any organization that's going to put them on air or in content, right? They're open to these kind of conversations because they know that the model is changing. You know, I still love TV. It's a great thing. But the fact of the matter is everybody has got their other projects that they're working on. Does anybody recognize the name Bill Simmons? Okay, a few head nods. Guys are a little quiet. I know it's getting toward lunchtime. I'll tell you a story about collaboration with Bill Simmons. So one of my good friends at ESPN and I would get together pretty regularly, and we'd talk about what was working, what was not working, and then what else did he want to do. So many years ago, I said to him, I want to work with Bill Simmons. And he said, you're crazy. He's not advertiser friendly. I said, I don't want to be the guy's friend. I just want to work with him because he's got a big audience. So we were putting together an enormous deal with ESPN for a lot of exposure. And they came to me and, like, at the end of the day, trying to throw me a bone, like, and we'll figure out something to do with Simmons. And I'm like, no, that's not good enough. We got to define it, right? So I said, I think you guys are going to do, and this is a long time ago before this word was even known, I think you guys are going to do podcasts with him, right? And the ESPN sales guys are like, that's worth nothing. And I'm like, great, I want it, but I also want to pay you for it because I think it's going to be valuable. So I paid them a very small sum as part of this larger contract to do the Bill Simmons podcast. Well, the podcasts garnered an enormous audience. So about 1.5 years later, when we were negotiating the contract, they tried to slip in that the podcasts were going to be for $1.2 million. And I said, no. I said, I'm the one who taught you these things were valuable, so we're going to get them at a much lower number. But I actually, I wrote a little sports here. I did for a little paper in New Jersey after I graduated. I got to know Bill pretty well, and I often would have conversations with him about how can I help you. He did great stuff for us, and he was supposedly not advertiser friendly, right? Another relationship that happened over time, kind of similar to the one that I was trying to develop here with Anthony and Tracy, was Ryan Seacrest. So Ryan had a pet project because he's involved with children's hospitals. We kind of helped support that. And then we did a lot of stuff on radio with what is now iHeart. And Ryan actually picked up the phone to me to call me a few years ago and said, Tony, I want to do some work with NBC at the Olympics. This was 4 years ago when it was in London. But I want to do my radio show there. Is there any way that you and I can figure out a way that you can fund that production? Well, of course we did, and it worked out really well. If I had sat in my marketing plan for that year, 6 months in advance, and said, I'm going to do this thing with Ryan Seacrest, it wouldn't have been there. If I had a line for program development, which I did, that was kind of sourced real time. So, again, I was very fortunate when I was at Subway because I, kind of earned a lot of leeway over time but we always had a more development or even experimental portion of the budget, but we had to be accountable for that. Anybody know who the guy in the yellow shirt is? So that's the world's fastest human, about ready to win his gold medal in Rio. And as you probably know, he's got this interesting pose, right? So kind of like the $5 footlong, or kind of like, you know, cam dabbing. Again, in the world that we're in, simple symbols are more important than ever. And again, after the fact, it's like, oh, it's just a simple symbol. Well, it takes off, right? So what did Neymar do after they won? Neymar did the same thing, right? So we're talking about marketers needing to get their message out. I'm not saying that we should come up with the next dab or next symbol, because we may not be able to do it. But if you work with people that are creative and you give them the opportunity to do their thing, maybe you can build on that. I don't think this is too confidential, but with some of the folks that I'm working with now about, you know, potentially working with Michael going forward, you probably saw that scowling face of his at the Olympics with the hoodie on, right? That went all over the place. So is that a good marketing thing? Is that a good marketing thing a couple months down the road, or will its moment have passed, right? Is it going to live up to that word current, which I'm applying to somebody else now? I'm not sure, but that's a conversation that we're actually having real time. One other thing about real-time marketing. So the course that I play at in New Jersey hosted the PGA this summer, and they thought Rory McIlroy was going to do great. So Rory McIlroy had the great position within the Nike store inside the merchandise tent. Well, unfortunately, on Friday, Rory McIlroy hit a 340-yard drive down the 18th hole. Then he foolishly went for the pin and ended up short-siding himself in heavy rough, and took not one, not two, but 3 shots to get on the green, and bogeyed and missed the cut. So as I walked into the tent on Saturday morning, in the more high-traffic area, they had moved Brooks Koepka, who actually made the cut, and their more high-profile Rory moved back. And I said to the guy doing the merchandise, I said, how come you did that? And he said, well, you know, he didn't make the cut. And he said, we got to do everything now, or consumers will kill us for not knowing that he didn't make the cut. And that is actually the standard that consumers have you at now, right? If you're not paying attention to that stuff, you know, how many people are going to go through there in a day? 1,000? But that's probably why the Nike brand is so successful, because they're attuned to what's happening going on in real time in front of them. So as I kind of think about the future a little bit, this is a shot from Fitbit Blaze at CES in Las Vegas earlier this year. If I were still in the subway chair, I'd probably be saying, how the heck do I appropriately link myself to this, right? So there's obviously activity functions on phones. I certainly have one on my iPhone. But if you think about yourself being a healthy, active brand, don't you have to be part of this world, because that's where people are going. Technology is certainly a driver and a disruptor, and even if you've got a pretty good business, if you're not part of it, you're probably making a mistake. So that's a beautiful view from the lovely Napa Valley, and it's all about the road ahead. So I'm actually incredibly optimistic about the importance of marketers going forward. If you think about those charts that Rick was showing earlier in terms of the macroeconomic perspective, if you're in a 1.8 to 2.2 growth world, that doesn't work, okay? Marketing is going to have to be a driver, right? The reason I would say that all of those food companies' stocks have gone up, whatever it was, 72 points more than the average, is just because interest rates are low, right? So you probably have significant asset inflation because of low interest rates. And if you're not going to be able to show growth going forward, you're in trouble. And the best way you can show growth is by doing good marketing. So I'll end with the happy slide. I'm happy to take any questions, but it's a pleasure to be back here, and thanks very much for having me.